now not sure whether I was supposed to go on after that, and I messed it up, but either way, I'm here. My name is Damita Pressel, and I'm delighted to be here and to see all of you. So, if you haven't been to a pitch before, this is going to be an interesting format for you. I'll explain it in a minute, but first I'll explain what it's about. The world is obviously grappling with transformation at a huge scale right now, politically, socially, technologically. We see democracy, something that we took for granted for the longest time, at least for as long as I was alive, is being increasingly challenged and even in decline. The big question is, what direction is this trend going to take? And that is what's up for debate tonight. You are going to hear 3 presentations by 3 different speakers, each outlining a vision of what our coexistence might look like, how we will organize it in 2100, so 75 years from now. Whichever case you find the most convincing, you get to vote for. So we're now going to run a poll at the beginning to see where you stand now. There's a QR code behind me that will take you to the app. And your task right now is to vote for what you think is the most likely. So you have 3 options. One is the pitch for we are capable of so much more. So in 2100, everything is hunky-dory. We're prospering. We're living in a peaceful society. Everything is super democratic, and we all love each other. Your second option is we're muddling along somewhere in Middletopia. It's not great, but it's not terrible, and we're somehow making do. And for the doomsday apologists among you, you can vote for the third scenario, which is in this case, the first one, Mech Mafia, the sequel. So basically, everything that we talked about here for the past week was for nothing, and democracy is no more. Now, as you might be able to tell from the titles, the one entitled The Mech Mafia is the one that presumably we don't want. So that's the autocratic scenario. And then the second one is we are capable of so much more. Democracy is flourishing. We're all happy. And the third one is muddling through Middletopia. Now, it's not about what you would like to happen. I assume that we are all on the same page about that. It is what you think will happen. All right. Pretty tight between optimism and Middletopia there. Awesome. I'm going to introduce the 3 speakers that are going to make their cases, and then after that, you will have 5 minutes to ask questions to each of the speakers. And at the end, we're going to vote again, and we will see which speaker managed to change your mind and shift the most votes. First of all, your wonderful speakers, award-winning former BBC correspondent for Central Europe and author of several books, Misha Glenny. He's an expert on the Balkans and a visiting professor at LSE, UCL, and Columbia. If you could briefly stand up, maybe. Making the case for utopia will be anthropologist, speaker, and author Bettina Ludwig. She has worked with hunter-gatherer tribes, and this inspires her view on human nature, which she shares on stage, advocating for optimism, humility, and love. And then finally making the case for somewhere in the middle is writer and researcher Ron Ivey. He focuses on social trust and belonging, and he's a research fellow at the Harvard Human Flourishing Program. And without further ado, let's hear from Misha for the worst-case scenario.
Thank you. Hi. Well, that's great that I only got 12% in the first vote, because that means that I can't really lose. So great. I would has anyone ever wondered why billionaires always want more than they actually have? It's really quite extraordinary. I mean, because they can't spend that money in 500 years, let alone their own lifetime, and yet still they want more. I sometimes have this scenario of Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Peter Thiel sitting around playing Monopoly, but with real countries at stake. And I'm just baffled by billionaires. What do they actually do with their money? Well, some of them give to good causes, right? Well, that could be worse, giving to good causes, although, of course, philanthropy is the politics of whim. Some of them, however, like to buy or reap the rewards of ownership of social media networks, spreading their arbitrary opinions, often wacky, allowing the promotion of vile hatred, criminal organizations, and challenging democratically elected governments. Some of them invest in political strategies over decades in order to ensure their desired political outcomes. I must here recommend the seminal work on this issue, Jane Mayer's Dark Money. The Heritage Foundation, for example, and its many sister organizations from the 1980s and 1990s were designed by American oligarchic gazillionaires specifically to shift the political debate in the United States ever further to the right, in the expectation that someday a Donald Trump would come along and act as a willing cipher for their authoritarian urges. And boy, they were right. When I published my book, McMafia, Seriously Organized Crime, in 2008, much of the interest focused on the detailed description of organized crime bosses and their activities. I ascribed their rise to the vacuum created when states across the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe partially collapsed, creating a vacuum after the revolutions of 1989, and unable to manage the free-floating, emerging unregulated capitalism in the region. Now, as had happened in Sicily in the late 1860s, mafias filled the gaps as privatized law enforcement agencies, as they're known by sociologists. The following period in the 1990s saw the rise of gangster capitalism, in which organized crime exploited the absence of legal guardrails to not only act as the arbiters between members of the new business class, they also realized that they too could enter the market as players. In this period, the distinction between what was a legal and what was an illegal commodity disappeared, and so the mafia bought and sold everything from food and furniture to guns, drugs, and people being trafficked either for labor or sexual purposes. Most linked up with the sharpest of business people known as the oligarchs, who set about privatizing state assets at a knockdown price, bribing bureaucrats and using the muscle of organized crime to assert their purchases. Well versed in the history, however, of Eastern and Central Europe, many oligarchs sought to export their new fortunes to safer destinations. And the oligarchs from the East and their criminal associates, spotted immediately how the complex, obscure mechanisms of Western international finance were perfect for concealing their cash from prying eyes. In the 1990s and the 2000s, the West didn't care. London and New York were in a deregulatory race to become the financial capital of the world, and they both turned a blind eye to the origins of the lucre sloshing through the system in the United States and the United Kingdom. Financial institutions and Western politicians thought that, like the Russians, they had found their very own philosopher's stone, a way of transforming everything into gold. No risk, no return to boom and bust, in the words of Gordon Brown, Britain's former Treasury Minister. In McMafia, the sequel, however, the fusion of criminality, financial manipulation, and political influencing has gone right to the top, i.e. the United States of America. And this wasn't happenstance. When the Wall Street crash ravaged much of the world, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected on a promise to tackle the reckless profiteering banks as he described them. And his economic policy introduced an equitable capitalism that lasted until the Reagan presidency, ably assisted, of course, from across the pond by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. But after the financial crash of 2008, the banks, the hedge funders, and the 1% barely blinked. They carried on with their rent-seeking activities, so that since 2008, the wealth of the richest 1% has been growing at an average 6% a year, as opposed to 3% a year for all of the rest of us. Should that continue, incidentally, by 1930, the top 1% will hold wealth equating to $305 trillion, up from $140 trillion today. And that's just by 2030, I beg your pardon. During the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, i.e. since 2022, $26 trillion, that's 63% of all new wealth created, was captured by the richest 1%, while $16 trillion went to the rest of the world put together. For those who imagine that this class of super-rich is benign, let us remind ourselves of the Citizens United initiative in 2010, which enabled corporations to be interpreted by US law as private citizens, human beings. The wealthy sponsors of this project wanted to ensure that their money would determine the outcome of American elections at county, state, and federal levels. Trump threw in his sixpence worth by rigging the federal court system, including the Supreme Court, where charmers like Clarence Thomas still rule the roost. Since 2008, we have seen the rise of illiberal democracy, as its most successful practitioner, Viktor Orban, called it. A network of like-minded leaders, including Geert Wilders, Jarosław Kaczynski, Benjamin Netanyahu, Jair Bolsonaro, Robert Fico, and more, are building international networks, throwing spanners in the works of democracy wherever they can, all to keep themselves out of prison or to add to their or their friends' and families' enormous wealth. They have allies in the world of full-blown autocracies, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and now they rarely disguise their friendly relationships with these characters. Autocracies have two advantages over democracies: the ability to make quick decisions. The current German coalition, for example, is a classic case of a democratically elected government entirely unable to respond to events because of squabbling in the cabinet. Autocracies can also engage in long-term planning without the inconvenience of having to please electorates all the time. China has used this to great advantage in the construction of a modern communications infrastructure. To this, you've got to add zero accountability, contributing to AutoCAT's freedom of action, the devastating effect that social media is having on the political process, and how disinformation favors those who want to stir up conflict and instability in favor of corrupt political forces. You have issues like migration, which the autocrats exploit mercilessly in the democratic states. And then you have to add the adamantine monopolies constructed in Silicon Valley. And here my second recommendation is an essay by Ben Tarnoff called From Manchester to Barcelona, which explains why the Googles and Microsofts of this world are much more powerful than the robber barons of the United States were in the second half of the 19th century. Increasingly, you see the oligarchs of Silicon Valley depart from the kumbaya philosophy of the internet's pioneers to support instead the most reactionary candidates and governments in the world. I do not believe that oligarchs and autocrats will necessarily rule the world, but they will if Democrats don't recognize the danger and start doing something about it. Acting in a strategic political manner and also challenging, not just rhetorically, but with action, the neoliberal capitalist model, for make no mistake, it has not just survived, but thrived on financial, climate, and health chaos. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just an analysis, it's a call to action. If we don't do something, the autocrats, the oligarchs, and the criminals will rule the world. Thank you.
Is it Q&A? Yeah. Well, that was uplifting. Thank you. I think we have time to take about 2 to 3 questions. Do we have any? We're all in a stupor of like, oh my God. There's one there, there's another one there, and maybe a woman if we have one. I can shout it like this. Yes.
What kind of action do you propose?
That's the $64,000 question. Basically, democracies have to act with more strategic purpose. They have to resist the temptation of populism. I would take as an example one of my 2 countries. I'm British and I'm Irish. The first one, of course, went for Brexit. This is one of the most catastrophic acts of self-harm that a democracy has ever inflicted on itself, but with huge implications for other people in the European Union. And so we need more intelligence in our politics, we need more energy from our politicians, and to be less concerned about petty conflicts, both within their own parties and between political parties in democracies. That's a short answer, but believe me, there's a lot more.
We have another one over here.
Maybe a quick question, because you studied and you wrote about the Balkans. How much of your pessimism stems from that history?
Well, I have to say, quite a lot is the answer to that. After the wars in the former Yugoslavia, before that, I had been basically an optimist, fundamentally an optimist, and the wars turned me away from that. However, I sort of took a break from the Balkans in 2004 to write McMafia, although it all starts in the Balkans, and I did quite a lot of work in Brazil. And what I noticed is that in Brazil, life can be as miserable, as unfair, and as enervating as it is in the Balkans. And yet Brazilians manage to have a great time. They party all the time there. It was actually an extremely uplifting experience. But Brazil is a big country with a lot of self-confidence. There is a chronic lack of self-confidence in the Balkans. But this is one area where I think it's a great example to answer the last question. If the European Union really starts thinking strategically, it will absorb the Western Balkans into the European Union, whether through a hybrid mechanism or through full membership straight away, it doesn't matter. But that would be a signal that democracies are serious about trying to stabilize regions as opposed to just pandering to perceived trends and beliefs within their own electorates.
We have time for one, maybe 2 more.
What do you believe is the role of technology in this race? Because you've described business and economics, politics, and I think now the rise of AI is maybe accelerating even some developments.
So we have never lived through a period in history where technological revolution has had such a rapid and accelerating impact on social relations between people. If you take the 2 other major revolutions, the printing of the book and the Industrial Revolution, compared to that, what is happening with the information technology revolution is everything is accelerating, and it is getting harder and harder for individuals and collectives to understand how and why their environment is changing and how it impacts on them. And to be honest, it makes people frightened. At the moment, we have virtually no regulatory system on these major technologies, and we need to impose them fairly soon. Above all else, I would say, we need to have regulatory capacity for social media networks. It is absolutely unacceptable for Elon Musk to tweet that Britain is on the verge of a civil war after the riots broke out following the Southport murders. And had I been Keir Starmer at that point, I would have said, we're closing down Twitter tomorrow.
Ladies and gentlemen, the scarily accurate Mita Glenny. Well, that was difficult to listen to at times, but very convincing, I found. For a more optimistic case, please welcome on stage Bettina Ludwig.
So there was one night in the Kalahari Desert in Namibia that I remember vividly. I'm a cultural and social anthropologist, and I work with one of the last hunting and gathering societies of our planet. And I'd like to tell you the story about this one night that somehow has got a lot to do why I'm standing here today as well. So I'm working with these hunter-gatherers. So imagine we're in the open Kalahari. There's no infrastructure, no electricity, no cars, nothing, no houses. So people live outdoors 24/7 their whole life. So what they do at night is they gather around the fireplace and they tell each other stories. They talk about the stuff that they ate, what happened to them, what they hunted, what they gathered, what was funny, what was sad. They just share their stories. And at this very night that I remembered so vividly, people did the same. And I had the honor and the pleasure to be among them. So, I tried to understand something. I didn't speak the language fluently back then, but I tried to understand some vocabularies and phrases. And after some time, I felt such a positive feeling because I was like, wow, I can be part of this. There's nothing, pitch dark. You hear some hyena somewhere in the open Kalahari. There's just stars above your head. And after some time, when the children, when they get tired, they start sleeping. They sleep right next to the fire because the fire is up all night so that wild animals won't come close to the community. So people started to sleep. First the children, then more children, then the first adults. And I had the feeling, okay, I get tired as well. I'm going to go to my tent. So while I'm sleeping in the tent, that's time for another story. It's got to do with elephants, even though the tent wouldn't help. When you cross elephants, however, I got to my tent and tried to sleep. And when I was in my tent, I all of a sudden got really, really sad. And I asked myself, what's going on? I really started crying and I was so sad. And I didn't realize why and what was going on. So I said, okay, why are you crying? What's the thing? And after some time, like really talking to myself, I realized one thing. The people there in the Kalahari Desert, when they come into this world, when they are born, they have a sense of community. They have a sense of belonging. They know that they are part of this community. They know that they are part of something that is way bigger than themselves. And at this very moment in my tent, I realized, wow, the community I come from, let's call it the Western world. I'm from Austria, Europe, so let's call it the Western world. Many people don't have this sense of community, of connection, of belonging. And that made me really sad. And at the same time, it gave me some energy and movement and action because I felt like I want to go home to my community and work on this. That's the thing, that's a topic that's right in the center of everything. The scarcest resource in the Western world is a sense of belonging. Now, to me, belonging is a central aspect when we talk about democracy. In fact, I think it's entrenched in the concept of organizing society democratically. So now, the question is, why am I still optimistic then when there's a lack? Well, there's two reasons. The first reason is that the hunter-gatherer communities, they taught me, guys, we're capable of way more than we think. So let me tell you why I think about it that way. So for example, where to start? Well, hunter-gatherer communities, they organize themselves radically different than most of the people in this room will, maybe even all of the people. So for example, hunter-gatherer communities, they count till 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and everything after that is many. They don't have a past tense or a future tense, so they cannot talk about the far future or the far past. That's just grammar-wise not possible. Even though they can think it to the future, obviously, in the past, they're people like us, but culturally, it doesn't make any sense to them. They live in the very moments. They don't have a concept of hierarchy, so there's not one Häuptling or one boss who says, okay, I decided for every one of us, we're going to do it that way. Everyone decides. Everyone is included in the decision-making processes. And even hunter-gatherer communities, they don't have a concept of ownership. Nothing belongs to anybody, or everything belongs to everybody, however you want to see it. Now, this is obviously radically different. But again, it gave a lot of motivation to me, because I felt like, okay, when we are able to walk through our worlds, thinking 5 is the highest number, and at the same time, in other parts of the world, I guess everyone in this room would say, no, infinity is the highest number, and both things are possible at the same time. That's not somewhere 150,000 years ago, but right now, just somewhere else. People go through their lives with whole different worldviews. Now imagine, if it's possible at the same time, imagine what's going to be possible in the future. I am 100% sure that we are going to organize ourselves in ways and with structures that we have no clue already. But we're capable of it. Because if you think it through, we are the ones, like the human species, who is the only species who is capable of doing communication through complex symbols. Now let me explain you that. So for example, we take one line and we take another line and we say this is a cross. It's just 2 lines. But within these 2 lines, we see rules, institutions, a history, regulations, we see religion. That's the human power. That's what we are doing. We make a cow a holy cow. We take a little pebble somewhere from the ground and say, that's a diamond. We take a ring and say, I'm married. So that's what we're capable of. And that's only just a little tiny bit of it. Now, I'm not the one who would say, okay, let's go back. Let's live as hunter-gatherers again. No, obviously that wouldn't work. That's not possible. But I'm the one who says, okay, let's broaden our horizon. Let's open up. And let's be able for it, let's be ready kind of for this time that we're living where it's about holding questions. It's not always about giving answers. And I know we need a lot of answers, and obviously we're all working on it. But at some point, the question is, which spaces do we need to create in order to be able to hold questions collectively? And I could go far more into detail with that, but you know the time's running, so let me give you the second reason why I'm so optimistic. I'm optimistic because, to me, optimism is nothing more and nothing less than the active decision for a positive look into the future. And optimism, to me, calls you to act. It prompts you to action, actually. So when we look at fear, pessimism, negativity, this has always been the easy way, and it would always stay the easy way. Because what pessimism tells you is to kind of lean back, watch the scenery, be cynic, the world's going down anyways. But if you look at optimism, if you look at hope, if you look at love even, that's always been the hard way. But on the other hand, it's the only way to go, right? And it calls us to act. And the thing is, I mean, if we think about it, democracy, it entrenches the whole idea of all of us to act. I mean, that's the whole idea of democracy, that everybody acts, that no one's laying back and is cynic and does nothing, but that everyone acts. And well, being in Alpbach for a few days now already, yesterday I had this feeling of there's different worlds around here. So to me, there's one world of control, which is good and we all need, but there's also one world of surrender and of holding questions and of thinking about which spaces do we need where we can come together and be human. So I think these 2 worlds, they should mingle, and I think they will, but we need to do our bit so that they can mingle. And with this said, I'd like to end, which might be a bit weird. I wasn't sure if I'm going to do it, but now I'm going to do it because I talked about love already, and I talk about love in business in general a lot. So, at some point I don't care anymore. So I'm going to share a song with you guys. And this song, someone kind of gave to me in the Kalahari Desert. At another night at the fire, there was this this young man from Britain, and he shared this song that he wrote himself. Said me, including the people, everybody loved it. And I felt back then, I want to bring it back to my community, and maybe you like it as well. So let me end with this song. I don't actually know the name, but it goes like this. We might put it all back together, one piece at a time. We might learn to live our future, one step at a time. We might learn to tell our stories, one word at a time. When our hearts and minds come together, combined. When our hearts and minds come together, combined. So I ask you now, what are you choosing? To be a pessimist or an optimist? Thank you.
Well, I bet you weren't expecting that, were you? Do we have any questions for Bettina? There's one over there.
Hi. Thank you very much for that, and beautiful singing voice, by the way. I think my question is, I so agree with this sentiment of we need this, optimism and moving towards co-governance and trying to have this feeling of community, but how do we do that when there is this, what feels like a hegemonic power of millionaires, going back to it, or politicians who are eager and happy to be stuck within the system that we currently are?
So when it's about community, democracy, belonging even, I also ask myself, so how can we make the world outside more democratic, and how can we create this togetherness? And at one point I realized it's not about asking, how can I make the world outside more of that, but it's asking, how can I be more of that? So let me give you an example of what I did. I think it's 1.5 years ago at my birthday, I had this idea of starting a project which was called 100 Days of Giving. So I started to give one thing unconditionally every day to strangers. So for example, I smiled at strangers on the street, which is really weird because I live in Vienna, and those of you who know Vienna, that's weird, the most unfriendly city in the world. Or I started to listen to people. I said, I'm going to listen to you for 15 minutes and I won't talk. I actually had a person that started crying because she said, wow, that never happens to me. That's the world we live in, where people start crying when you tell them you're going to listen to them. Or I invited people, or I spontaneously gave flowers to the woman at the bakery, like at the
bakery.
At the bakery, thanks. Because I had them, I wanted to take them with me home, but then I saw her and I was like, thank you very much, because you are working for us all the time, giving me my coffee in the morning. Thanks so much. And she even also started tearing up, and then I had to tear up as well because she did. But the thing that happened there was the moment of connection. And now the interesting part is, I did this for 100 days. So if you do it the first day, the second, the third, you feel really weird. The seventh, it's better. But after 10, 20, 30 days, you start realizing something's going on with you. And after 100 days, you're 100% transformed. Because you realize that this connection, the sense of community, of belonging, of democracy, of working together, it comes out of you. And you are the one who is able to connect with everyone. The connection won't come from the politicians or from whoever. You and me and we are the human beings. We are the ones who are able to connect. And this is something that, his research tells us. When we sing together, when we dance together, when we listen actively together, when we speak from the heart, then there is those hormones. So, all the lucky hormones, kind of, they call it, the dopamine, the endorphin, serotonin, yeah. So there's a lot of research about that we are able to produce them ourselves. And the thing is, we are wired for that. We are wired for human connection. And the crazy thing is that we forgot about that. And the wonderful thing is that we can start right again and right now. I think there's really it's really about us acting also on every little layer, but we shouldn't forget ourselves individually.
Thank you. We have time for one more quick question. Yes, please.
Sorry, that was a very, very long answer. Trying to be a little shorter.
Thank you. What do you say to people who historically say that humans only survived because of pessimism, because we saw risk and we didn't run into frivolous activities, but were cautious because we saw the risk? And Nobel Prize winner Kahneman talks about this risk aversion bias and prospect theory. Yet you posit that optimism could work, even though maybe evolutionarily and historically pessimism has served us better.
Okay, now I'm surprised because I've never heard about that pessimism served us evolutionarily. I even wouldn't agree, so I'm happy to read into that, and if I could learn more about it from your side. But I think there's a huge difference in terms of risks if you jump off a cliff or say, I'm gonna stay here, or in economic settings, what I usually do as a job, and talk about love in business, which feels like a risk as well, and feels really scary sometimes. But that's such a spectrum, and I don't think that people evolutionary seen that they were just pessimists. So yeah, that's an interesting viewpoint. So I'm happy to learn more about that, but I really don't think so. And when I work with the hunter-gatherers, for example, so because we've been on this planet for 300,000 years, and 280,000 years we've been living as hunter-gatherers. So obviously we didn't exactly the same way that people do it today, but still you can have a little glimpse of how it may have worked. And you see that people are not pessimistic. Maybe they're not even optimistic because they live very much in the moment. So maybe there's even a third component to this, living so much in the moment that it's not always about optimism and pessimism even.
Thank you so much. Bettina Ludwig.
Thank you.
You've heard two scenarios that could not be more different. We have heard peace, song, dance, and prosperity, and we have heard doom, gloom, autocracy, and oligarchy. The man in the middle, for the middle ground, Ron Ivy.
All right, well, I have two challenges that I had to overcome today. One, I found out about this pitch about 4 hours ago, so I'm doing this all improv, so give me a little bit of grace. But the second challenge is I tend to agree with both of them. But here's why. First, Misha, he talks about wealth inequality. I spent time working on this exact issue in terms of wealth concentration in the United States, working with researchers, policymakers, and also actually talking to billionaires about this issue. And so I agree with some of the statistics and the trends, but I'll come back to that later. But there's also another side to that story. I also agree with Bettina because I've been studying loneliness and working on the loneliness issue with the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, looking at this rise of disconnection and alienation and how it plays into distrust, particularly in the United States. So I found myself saying yes, yes, yes to both of them. But there are elements of what they're saying that I say no, no, no to. So those are my two challenges that I've got to overcome. But first, I want to start with a story about myself and kind of how I think about this challenge. So you go outside. What do you see when you go outside? Yes, humans. What else? Right now, if you were to walk outside, what would you see? Nature. Okay, great. What else? Forests? Cars. Is there anything else? It's very large and looming over us. Mountains. Okay. Where I grew up could not be the more complete opposite from Austria. The flattest place you could ever imagine. Oklahoma, down in the center of the United States. And where I grew up was actually in the northern part of the state in wheat country. If you were to come to my hometown, there were 9 grain elevators that you would encounter when you came to the city, or the town. And Le Corbusier, if you know the architect, he called these things cathedrals of engineering. So this was kind of the setting of my childhood. So wheat was kind of the central narrative and theme. And one of the parables that had a big impact on me as a small child is this idea of the wheat and the weeds. So the farmer goes out and he sows good wheat, So high quality wheat, not the American kind, the European kind. And he also nurtures it, he develops the soil, and at the same time, someone comes in and sows weeds in that soil. And someone comes to him and he sees these weeds growing up, and a child asks the farmer, what are you going to do? You're going to pull up all the weeds? And he says, no, I'm going to focus on growing the wheat. Don't worry about pulling out the weeds. We'll deal with that at the end. Now, what does that have to do with our question here, Middletopia? My thought is that we have problems when we say we're either going to utopia or dystopia, or when we try to push solutions to achieve a utopia, or when we try to address dystopia in a way that we're dealing with pessimism or optimism. And the reality is, all of human history, we've had wheat and we've had weeds. We've had wealth concentration that grew, and then movements rise up to address it. There's instability in those systems. That's the fundamental thing we found out in studying the wealth concentration and talking to these various individuals. They actually understand, if you get them in private rooms, that this is an unstable situation. I live a few blocks away. Right now, I actually live in Paris, France. I live a few blocks away from the Concorde, La Concorde, the area where there's the assassination of the kings. That was a very unstable scenario where you had all the wealth at the top, right? Then you have the flip side. There's also been movements that have encouraged connectivity and community and rebuilding trust. We saw this in various generations, particularly in my country in the progressive era. During the response to the Gilded Age, there was a upswell of dealing with the enemy and the alienation and the loneliness that was happening in urban areas, the social justice challenges, et cetera. But it goes in cycles. It goes up and down, right? And it's going up and down all throughout the world. It's changing in different ways. There's not one pathway up or one pathway down. So I'd say cycles is a key challenge, or key element that we need to think about. Sometimes as Westerners, we think either in linear terms, and that's just not the way the world works. The second is diversity. So when we think about democracy and autocracy, or authority and collaboration, freedom and control, if you're talking to someone in China, or you're talking to someone in Austria, if you're talking to someone in the Middle East, and you're talking to someone in the Midwest, where I'm from, there are different value structures that have evolved over time in different cultures. And so I think there's going to be continued diversity of autocracy and democracy in our world 100 years from now, 75 years from now. We're going to see that same adaptation to technology is going to change everything. I agree with Misha. I'm actually working on a project right now on AI and human connection. Frightens me, but we're studying some of these AI trends. Different cultures will adapt differently to technology, and they will use their processes in different ways. Okay, so what do we do about that? How do we deal with these different cultures and different ways of approaching governance? Well, one is to actually connect with the human nature piece of this. If you look at the data, if you look at global surveys, there are patterns that connect us between those that care about freedom and those that care about control, between those that are on the west and those that are in the east, between the north and between the south, between the right and the left. And the pattern that you see is actually what Bettina was talking about, which is this desire for connection and this fear of alienation, this desire to flourish, this desire to be happy. The outcomes of the process, the feelings, the experiences, that's where actually we have common ground. So instead of forcing our particular process, which in my case, my country, this is maybe controversial, but my country has forced democracy and by the gun in certain places. It's been a total disaster. It's disrupted whole societies. It's destroyed our society. It's had the biggest impact on the working class in our country. Forcing something on a culture that is not ready for it is not the way. it's focusing on our own culture and our own needs and our own approach to those outcomes, and then letting other cultures approach it in different ways, but building bridges. And yes, of course, advocating for human rights, but the way you go about it, you have to respect and engage in a way that you're not forcing it with violence. That's just not, it's not the way. It's not going to be a key way to be stable. The last thing about stability, which I think that's a key part of this, which is the goal of political systems is social peace and balancing that with freedom, is there is an element of both authority and hierarchy and collaboration and democracy that are built into the most stable systems. So recognizing that there are times for democracy, there's times for authority, there's times for hierarchy, there's times for collaboration. If you have either one way or the other, you're going to get stuck in the wrong kind of process for the wrong kind of situation. And then last, I'd say we need to think about ways to connect on this deeper level. I mean, we're talking about this in the United States right now in certain circles where we've had a very materialistic view of politics. We've thought about GDP, we've thought about material productivity, but we haven't gotten to these deeper questions of what is my purpose? Who are my connections? How do I become a good person? How do I give my community a sense of purpose? If we want to avoid the more negative scenarios, we have to deal at that level. We also have to deal with the differences in values and the different approaches to different cultures as we deal with these challenges of immigration and engagement of different civilizations and different cultures that are coming together. So I think we've got some muscles that we haven't worked very well in the technocratic framework, where we need to have deeper conversations about the metaphysical part of our life, and that's very uncomfortable. But people are starting to have that conversation in my country, in both the left and the right and the center, and that's promising, and I'm hopeful for the future, even if we have to muddle through and know that there's not always going to be a perfect outcome. Thank you.
That all sounded very sensible. Do we have questions for Ron? Yes, there's one over there.
Thank you. You mentioned about the circles, how it all goes through circles, and like there's different phases of development. And I was wondering, in your opinion, what phase of at what point of the circle are we now at this specific time in human development in our civilization? Thank you.
Not a hard question, right? No, I think for what I've looked at it and the community of friends and thinkers that are working together on this, I think we're getting to peak concentration. I think we're getting to peak isolation, peak alienation, and I think there's an upswing that's coming. I'm seeing that, at least in my own country. I can't speak to Austria or other places, but I also think there's starting to be more reasonable conversation relative to kind of expansionist policy around democracy and the military use, the use of military to expand democracy. There's more kind of realism about that. There's more realism about immigration, about how do we be thoughtful about how we balance that, these bringing in new cultures into an existing culture and welcome and hospitality, but also protecting those that are there, that are citizens. We're having more reasonable conversations on the center part of the politics. Not everywhere, but it's starting to happen. So I think there's a turn that's happening. But the wild card for me is AI. I don't know what will happen with this situation, and that keeps me up at night because of both the potential for centralization and also the potential for chaos. And then two, I'm very concerned about the power of the tech companies They know addiction, they know distribution, they know scale, and they know that our most important need right now is what Bettina's talking about, is connection. And now they've designed AI companions that can mimic the best parts of us and kind of cut out the worst parts of us. And so I'm really nervous about that particular scenario. So I don't know how that will affect this kind of upswing that I'm seeing. But even there, I'm seeing positive kind of conversations where some people in the tech industry are like, we kind of screwed, they won't say this publicly, but we kind of screwed things up. How do we do this differently this next time around? So that gives me hope, but the hope is mixed with fear. So you can hear the theme of mixed.
Mixed feelings, thank you.
Yeah.
One more I think we have time for. Yes, please.
So you talked about the fact that in history the US has tried to force democracy onto other nations and cultures, and that obviously has not worked and has had detrimental effects. And in your scenario this would not happen, but that you would rather try to build bridges with other forms of governance. My question relates to whether in your scenario by 2100 you assume that the number of democracies stays constant or that this number will decline?
I would say more stability on both sides in terms of, I don't know that there's necessarily, I haven't done this sense that there's going to be a dramatic shift between the kind of bent towards authoritarian or higher levels of authority on the eastern side and a bent towards democracy on the west. And that also includes, I think, to some degree, I mean, I don't have experience with Latin America, but just more experience in working in the continent of Africa. I think there's going to be a mix there, and I think that's where there's already pushback I'm seeing in how we approach it from the United States. So I think it's more muddled. I think it's more balanced. If we're wise about it, I don't think we'll push ourselves to further towards World War III, which sometimes feels like where we're going right now. So yeah, that's my hope maybe and my sense of where things are going.
Thank you so much.
Oh, go ahead.
I don't think we have time. Unfortunately, I have to be quite strict with the Q&As, otherwise it's not fair.
That's right.
So thank you so much, and can I have all the speakers join me on stage? It's time for the big reveal. All right, you have 2 more minutes now
Me too.
to vote
I really liked both.
again. And I'm hoping you either have the app already open on your phone or the QR code shows up. There it is. So if you need to scan it again, please do so. And please vote on who convinced you. Have about 1:30 left. So which case did you find most convincing? Was it the quite dystopian one that Misha made? Was it Bettina's call for optimism? Or was it something in the middle? Have about 1 minute. I can hear some people are discussing maybe their votes. It's an election, guys. Keep it free and secret.
If anyone would like a drink afterwards, do let me know.
No.
We do have a bet
That is,
that whoever wins buys the other person the drink.
No.
So.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to disqualify you there. You have about 1 minute left to vote. And I see 60 of you have already voted. Ooh, very tight. Very tight.
Nice. Where's my wallet? I need to get.
This is not looking good for the world. But we do have 30 seconds. 20 seconds. Has everyone voted? It looks like you have, but for the sake of protocol, don't want to be accused of election interference. All right.
Getting tight.
5.
I'm feeling a bit like the
Yeah,
FPA.
it's exciting. 5 seconds. And I believe these are the final results. All right. So,
Congratulations.
Congrats. Congrats.
Thank you very
That's great. Good job.
much.
it looks like the case for dystopia gained 25%, the case for optimism lost 8%, and the case for somewhere in the middle lost a grand total of 17%. So, unfortunately, dystopia wins. Yay, I guess.
No.
No, we're glad.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much for joining us and for your very compelling speeches. And thank you for your votes. And I guess someone's owed some beers.
That's right. Thank you all.
Thank you.